Hello, I'm David Force from Faronel, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at a song from the early 14th century called Lulu, Where He Goeth. If you look this song up online, you'll find there is very little information about it. I couldn't find any commercial recordings of it, and I've only ever seen one performance of it on YouTube, which has now been taken down. It was discovered in the 1960s by Frank Harrison. He found it on a scrap of manuscript that had been pasted into a book of grammar, Latin grammar, that is now housed in the library of Trinity College in Dublin. And it was later published in the late 1970s in the iconic book that he produced with Dobson. Dobson and Harrison, of course, Medieval English Songs was a game changer for early music enthusiasts in the 70s and 80s, because it brought a lot of repertoire that was otherwise only accessible to those who had access to the original source material to a much wider audience. And it came with a comprehensive notes by Dobson on the texts and notes by Harrison on the music. Of course, things have moved on since then, and a lot of the scholarship that is incorporated in this book has now been superseded. And in particular, Harrison's transcription of the music from the source material has been brought into question. And I'm afraid I'm going to bring into question his transcription of this piece, because as it's presented in the book, it is rather odd and I think presents a barrier to performance. But before we look at the music, let's have a look at the text. Dobson's notes tell us that the dialect used in this text indicates that it originates from the southwestern corner of Suffolk and from the first quarter of the 14th century. A modern version of the words might go thus: "Look, look, look, where she goes. Because of her, I spilt my holy water. Look." The reference to the holy water tells us that we are dealing here with a parish clerk. In the medieval church, the parish clerk was second in importance to the parish priest in the church, and one of his jobs was to look after the holy water in the service. And many parish clerks are referred to in documents of the time as the holy water bearer. This parish clerk, of course, is not keeping an eye on his duties, but is rather keen to look at the passing lady. And as a result, he spills his water. This association between parish clerks and having an affection for ladies is recorded elsewhere in literature of the period. One famous example comes from The Miller's Tale from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. The central figure of Absalom is a parish clerk and also a musician. And Chaucer tells us, if you'll forgive my modern English version, "This Absalom, who was so light and gay, went with a censer on the holy day, censing the wives like an enthusiast, and on them many a loving look he cast." The censer, of course, was the vessel in which the holy water was carried. One of the curious features of the text in this song is that repetition of the syllable ter from water, water, ter, which is most odd, and yet, as I'm going to suggest later, is the key which unlocks the hidden secret of this song. So much for the text. Now let's have a look at the music itself. Harrison transcribed the music as we see it now on the screen. He observed that the scribe appears to have been relatively inexperienced in writing out music, and there are one or two infelicities in it. For example, the upper and lower lines of the music are of slightly different lengths, so it doesn't line up quite correctly. So one or two adjustments have to be made for that. And Harrison also applied a couple of theoretical techniques of the period, particularly those that relate to the proportion of notes in certain circumstances, to make it work. These kind of unwritten conventions are very much a feature of music even today. In fact, in the 18th century, for example, French organ music used a technique known as note inégale, in which in certain circumstances what would otherwise appear to be equal quavers were sometimes played with the first one longer and the second one shorter. And we still use techniques like that today in things like jazz, for example, where we swing quavers and give uneven note values to what appear to be even written note lengths. As Harrison transcribed it, the work sounds like this. can hear that the music contains a lot of thirds and sixths, which was a particularly English feature of music of this period, particularly for the two-part gimel style writing of that time. One of the criticisms that was laid at the feet of Dobson and Harrison at the time they produced their book was the lack of photographs of the original source material, so it was difficult to check up to see whether the transcriptions were correct or not. We're lucky to live in the digital age now, where many libraries have scanned and made public on the internet original source material, and here we must say a big thank you to Trinity College in Dublin for making this particular source available online. And here it is. You can see that it's fairly roughly written on a scrap of paper inside the book. Harrison's transcription proceeds quite well until we get towards the end, and then there are one or two things that I find puzzling. The first one is, why does he transcribe these two identical ligatures in different ways? The first one as crotchets and the second one as quavers. I would suggest that both of them should be transcribed as equal crotchets, and as we'll see in a moment, that makes a lot more sense of a feature which I'll talk about shortly. The second puzzling thing is that rest. Harrison based this on a thin vertical line, which he thought was a rest, but I suggest is probably a mistake on the part of the scribe. He started to write a note with a stem and then realised that that was not what was required, but instead of erasing it or scribbling it out, he just carried on with the note that he intended originally to write. So I think we can omit the rest. And lastly, we have the final note of the piece. If you look on the right hand side of the page here, you can see that it is really just a splodge. And indeed, I think that is actually what it is. It's quite clearly on the note F, which is the leading note of the mode, so absolutely not the right note to finish a piece like this on. It also is very poorly executed, and it also stands well apart from the rest of the music on the stave. And I really don't think it is, in fact, a note at all. It is merely just a splodge. And there are quite a few other marks of the pen, various doodlings and so forth on this page, rather like it. So if we adjust Harrison's transcription to take these features into account, we now arrive with this, which is starting to make a little bit more sense. But we still have this curious repetition of the syllable turf from water. When I first saw Harrison's transcription, it struck me what this might be. And I really can't believe that I'm the only person who has thought of this, but I'm not aware of anyone else having mentioned it in public before. We can solve the riddle of the extra ters by adding a little bit of modern notation that wasn't available, at least in this form, to our scribe in the 14th century. And if we do so, we get this. What we're actually looking at here are three alternative endings for the piece. Two of them are open endings, and the third and last one is a closed ending, which brings the piece to its conclusion. This idea of open and closed endings was actually a very common one in music of this period. We're listening now to the roughly contemporary Danse Réale from the Manuscript du Roi, and as this section proceeds, we move towards a open ending to the phrase. It leads us neatly back to the beginning. And now as we move through the phrase for the second time, we approach the closed ending, which finishes it off and allows us to move on to the next section. Sometimes these open and closed endings were indicated in the music by words, often in French, ouvert or clos. But in many cases, including this one, there is absolutely nothing to distinguish them. The musician playing would have realised which was which. And I think that's what we've got here in Lou. We've got three cadences, if you like, for the ends of the main phrase. Two take us back to the beginning, and the third one finishes the piece for us. If that's correct, then this, I think, is how this piece should sound. unusual for a piece like this to have 3 iterations of the main melody, but I'm wondering perhaps whether there's a bit of a musical joke going on here. We know that in the liturgy for the Mass, for example, there is a lot of Trinitarian symbolism. So we get 3-part Kyries, a threefold Christe eleisons, 3 sanctuses, and so forth. And I'm wondering whether the 3 iterations of our melody is a kind of allusion to that. It's an ironic sort of comment on the fact that our naughty parish clerk should be being holy with his holy water, but in fact is giving an eye to the ladies as they go by. So there it is. That's Lulu Lu, and my suggestion of how it goeth.